why I love church. Last Sunday, a little girl, maybe 4, walked by herself across the aisle, left her parents, and climbed into the lap of a woman who is 83 years old and lives alone. And so just in that little story, you have a little girl who's having an incredible immersion experience in relationality. You have this 83-year-old woman who is having this experience of powerful relationality. You have the parent who's observing this, or I guess maybe it's not the parent, maybe it's another congregation member, who's observing this and is participating by observing. The parent of this child, others around as well. So this kind of thing, it's like fish in water. We're immersed in it. It happens all the time. We're not cognizant that this kind of powerful healing activity, this relational activity, is happening in our congregation. So part of what I want to do to sort of draw our attention to it and make sure that we're really focused on that as we think about what it means to be a trauma-informed congregation. So just to start off with defining trauma, what do we mean by trauma? And so I like this graphic because it sort of shows a couple of different dimensions of trauma. So if you look at the tree part above the ground, those items that are listed there, the incarceration, divorce, maternal depression, emotional and sexual abuse, these are things that were on a study that was done back in 1997 called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And they interviewed 17,000 people. These were middle class, mostly white, insured people in the Kaiser Permanente health plan. So these were all people that had insurance. And what they found was on those 10, there were 10 items that they asked people about related to traumatic personal experience that they may have had as children. And what they found was that those people who had at least one or more experiences of trauma, that there was a significant impact on their health outcomes in adulthood. So what happened to them as children actually impacted their health later in life significantly. Like I couldn't say this word earlier either, statistically significantly. So also found that these experiences are very common. So the study showed that in this sort of white middle class insured population, 2/3 of people had had at least one of these experiences. And for those that had had one experience, 80% of those had had at least one more. So it's very common, and it's not uncommon as well for people to have 3 or more, 6 or more. And when you get up to 6 or more of these experiences, and these are not hard experiences to start to rack up. If you have one, if you have an incarcerated parent, you may also have a divorced parent. You may also have a parent with substance use disorder. When you get to 6, then the impact really starts to set in. So people, on average, people who have 6 or more adverse childhood experiences die 20 years earlier than people that don't have any of these experiences. So it's impacting people. People get chronic diseases. It impacts, their mental health is also a huge connection. Lots of different things that impact that lower people's mortality rate and increase their morbidity rate, the number of diseases that they get over time. So that's just one dimension of it, though, and that was the study that was done back in 1997. But after that, there was another study done in Philadelphia that said, okay, those were mostly white, insured, middle-class people. What happens when we actually begin to take in community-wide experiences of trauma? So including food insecurity, like do you feel like you know where your next meal is coming from as a traumatic experience? Is there violence in your community? Have you experienced violence? Have you witnessed violence? Have you been bullied? Things like that also were identified. And then they found that the rates were even higher for people who had experiences of trauma. So it's not, I think it's really important when we talk about trauma and traumatic experience and adversity that we're not thinking about those people, that we're actually talking about us. And we use us language because it is us. It's most of us have had these kinds of experiences and are impacted by it in many different ways. The other thing that's not captured in those two studies is historical trauma. And that's also really important to talk about, because that's racism is historical trauma. So you have whole populations of people that over generations have experienced oppression. You think of Palestinians who over generations have lived in an environment of occupation. Native Americans over generations have lived in an environment of oppression and dissociation with the rest of society. Jewish people, of course, African Americans with our history of racism. So those also, in the science, it's not just we think this is actually scientifically demonstrated that those historic experiences of trauma also profoundly impact our bodies long term. That there are mechanisms in our body to help us cope with that sort of wear our bodies down. And the other thing that's not up there that came up in the last group too is experiences of war and sort of conflict, refugee experience, that kind of thing. There's this community psychologist in Chicago who's actually nationally known, Carl Bell, who does a lot of work around trauma and resilience. And I really love this saying that he has, which is that risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. So all these things that we're talking about in terms of, if you have traumatic experience in your life, you are much more likely to have chronic disease, physical pain, obesity, depression, suicide, substance use disorder. All of these kinds of things actually go like step by step. The more experiences that you have, the more likely you are, like drastically likely you are to have chronic disease, to have pain, to have to be suicidal, to have substance use disorder. But what Carl Bell says is there are things that protect us from those impacts of those traumatic experiences. And those are called protective factors. And we're going to talk a lot about those coming up, because I think a lot of those protective factors actually live within congregations. This is what we do. We embody and live out these protective factors. So you can't say, because I've had, I can count 4 traumatic experiences in my life, that I'm going to be sicker and, because maybe there were some things that protected me from that. So what are those, and how do we really build on those in congregations? So we were talking about trauma and all different kinds of trauma. So you have ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Those are those 10 different experiences of adversity that the study was based on. Other kinds of traumatic experience, post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury. Are people familiar with this term moral injury or soul injury? Somebody want to say something about that? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but so basically it's post-traumatic stress disorder. We usually think about is when something happens to you that is, disruptive, or where you're in danger and you have to protect yourself in some way. But soul injury is sort of the other thing, where you have had to do something to someone else that violates your own moral code. And the spiritual distress that causes is so profound. One of the leading causes of suicide, particularly for veterans. Veterans who come back, and we know that suicide among veterans is a huge issue. And a lot of it has been traced to this moral injury, this I have had to do things that do not fit with what I believe is right. So that's another really important, because the main impact of that is on the spirit. And so in terms of the role of the church, the role of faith communities, this is a really important place for us to step up. There are a lot of faith-based folks that are doing that. So all of that, think of all of that, and then you have this being held in this field of hope. So we have all of this traumatic experience, but at the same time, we also have these experiences of hope, of well-being, of positive social connection. So part of how I want to think about this is not just there's a trauma over here and there's hope over there, but actually that those traumatic experiences are held within experiences that give us hope in some way. So this hope thing is actually, was developed by the Casey Foundation. It means health outcomes of positive experience. So they're saying you have adverse childhood experience or adverse experiences, but then you also have positive experiences, and that they are equally impactful in terms of our health outcomes, in terms of our spirits, in terms of what it is that what happens to our bodies and our minds and our spirits. And again, the fascinating thing to me is the thread through all of this research into these positive experiences and the health outcomes that happen as a result of these positive experiences is relationality and these healthy, positive relationships. So it's the relationship that's the kind of the underpinning factor in what it is that creates health outcomes that are positive. Social support is the most powerful protection against being overwhelmed by stress and trauma. The critical issue is reciprocity, being truly heard and seen by the people around us, feeling that we are being held in someone else's heart and mind. So that's, if you think back to, I think it was Sarah who was talking about belonging. Was it Sarah that was talking about belonging and how you can have access, you can be in a space, but if you're not actually, if you don't have the feeling that you're being held in someone else's heart and mind, it's a totally different thing. But if you have the experience of being truly heard and seen by the people around you, that is the most powerful protective factor. That's the most powerful healing thing that can happen. So again, as we start to think about how do we create healing congregational communities, or how do we create trauma-informed communities, we have to really take seriously this function or this practice of relationality, relationships, and how do we nurture those in congregations? How are we intentional about that? So the National Survey of Children's Health did a series of studies about this topic, about how positive experiences in childhood impact health. And so they looked at a whole bunch of different things related to childhood health, ACEs, family relationships, schools, healthcare, flourishing. So they did studies, and so I'm going to just share a couple of their findings. What they found was, in terms of positive childhood experiences, that there were 4 areas that were statistically significant in terms of the outcomes longer term for children's health. The first one was that children needed to have nurturing and stable relationships and supportive relationships. And even though this is about children, these studies, this is really about all of us. I mean, this research was done on children, but this is true for all of us. We adults need this too. So don't just think, okay, this is just for kids. This is all of us. So nurturing and supportive relationships. When kids had nurturing and supportive relationships, they do. When we have nurturing and supportive relationships, we do better. We do physically better, where our health is better. Safe, stable, protective, and equitable environments in which to play and learn is really important. So not having a lot of chaos in your environment, feeling like you have enough resources, that there are enough resources for you, for your people, for your peers, in your environment, there's enough to do what it is that you need to do. Those are some of the things that are part of that. Constructive social engagement and connectedness. So feeling like you have agency to make a contribution to your community, and that you feel connected to your community, like what you do is actually going to make a difference in your community. Again, great for kids, but also great for us. We need that too as adults. And then the last one, helping kids develop social and emotional competencies. So we talked a little bit about that in the last one, and that really has to do with, do you have the kind of inner stability to be able to be calm in a kind of stressful situation? Do you have the emotional kind of, what do we call it, emotional intelligence, to be able to notice that someone else is having trouble and to be able to help them? Those kinds of things. Do you have the sort of people skills, the basic relationship skills? Are those being taught to you in some way, being modeled for you in some way? And we sort of learn these things just by, again, being immersed in it. But it may be that we actually need to teach those things a little bit more. There was a pastor that I talked to years ago who actually did some of this with her confirmation kids. So she would take them on a pastoral visit, and they would talk about, how are we getting ready for this pastoral visit? And when we come in, what are we going to say to this person as a way of introducing ourselves and getting the conversation going? And then they would brief afterwards about, well, what did we do, and what was that like, and what did you learn? And so very, very intentional teaching about how do we be with each other. And then another one of their studies looked at the 3 parental attitudes or attributes that support resilience. And again, these were for kids, but these are for all of us. So what is it that parents are doing that supports resilience in their children? And number 1 was, well, I don't know if they're in any particular order, but meaningful conversations. So really talking with a kid and really wanting to hear from a kid. What do you think? What are you wondering about? What's your idea about this? So meaningful conversations about things that matter was one. And we need that too. When parents participated in their kids' activities and knew their friends, that was also significant for kids predicting that kids would be able to be resilient long term. Did their parents come to their soccer game? Did their parents come to school play? Did they show up at their events? And did their parents know their friends? Did they know their friends' names? Did they about them? Did they, have a relationship with their friends as well? And then the last one, could parents manage their own? And that's something, again, that I think a lot of times in faith communities we help each other with. There's informal kind of sharing about parenting that happens, and advice giving, and connecting people with resources and that kind of thing. And again, I'm sure you can think of examples from your own life, congregation, about how that kind of thing happens. But how do parents, how are we able to manage our own stress when we relate to our kids was another attribute that made a difference in resilience. Okay, and so, and then one of the other ones that they did had to do with factors. So if someone had reported three or more experiences of adversity as children, so they'd had a parental divorce, they'd had a parent with a mental health disorder, and they had a parent who was incarcerated, let's say. So they had three things. The things that helped mediate, that helped to protect from those experiences were, one, if they felt their family stood by them, like they could count on the family to stand by them in a time of that was one thing that would help mediate experiences of adversity. Another one was if they felt like they had someone to talk to about difficult feelings. Is there someone that they could talk to? That, if you had three or more adverse experiences, if you had felt like there was someone you could talk to, that makes a difference, and that helps to protect against the impact. Did they feel supported by friends during childhood? Were there friends that they could rely on? Did they have friends that they could turn to or talk to, or who would understand what it was that they were going through? And then finally, were there community traditions that they participated in that were meaningful? So think about this in terms of if we want to get to a place where we have trauma-informed congregations, where we really see our congregations as places that can provide some of this protection. Because we recognize that most of us go through these kinds of experiences. We might want to really think about, how do we make sure that our kids, that we support families so that kids can feel like, yeah, my family stands by me. How do we help to nurture that kind of family life? Maybe it's, for a long time I've wanted to do some kind of a project around family meals. What can we do to get families to eat together more? That would be one way to kind of support this idea that, yeah, my family's there for me. We eat together, we talk together. Are there people within the congregation that young people can talk to? The most significant evidence-based thing that's different who are experiencing adversity is a positive relationship with a caring adult. And so it may be that it's the youth group leader, or it may be the Sunday school teacher, it may be a friend's mother within the congregation, or some within the congregation, Bible school, vacation Bible school leader, whoever. A lot of times we have these kind of intergenerational relationships, or we may find ways to create them through mentoring or other kinds of things. But when we do it, we should understand that what we're doing when we help to create those kinds of things, that is profound healing activity for kids who may be experiencing things that we have no idea about. So I think part of becoming trauma-informed, and I keep doing like this because, and you guys can help with this, because I think there's a lot of energy right now in social services, healthcare, psychology, around this whole thing of trauma and resilience, and everybody's schools are becoming trauma-informed. But it's still pretty new, and there's not a lot of stuff in the faith space that's being done about this now. But I think there's a lot of potential for us to step into that space, but also for us to begin to think about what's our language. How do we talk about this as people of faith, from our theological minds, from our theological traditions, our biblical traditions? How do we talk about trauma and resilience, and what's the words that, what are the words that have the power for us in our settings? So I'm inviting you as sort of thought partners to really think about that as well. And where was I going? I had another point I was going to make there. When we think about becoming trauma-informed, to really kind of take seriously even this sort of organic, natural, relational stuff that we do all the time. Yeah. Okay, so I like this science. This may not be interesting to you. I just want to show you. So for example, with adults that had reported 3 or more adverse childhood experiences, but they also had these positive experiences that I just went through, those who were diagnosed with adult depression, if they had a sense that their family stood by them, 27% of, now this is of people who had 3 adverse childhood experiences or more, reported adult depression. Whereas 48% of people who didn't feel like their family stood by them reported adult depression. Does that make sense? For those that had 3 or more than 3 adverse childhood experiences but felt supported by friends, only 31% reported adult depression, but 49% who didn't feel like their friends were supporting them experienced adult depression, and so on. So you see what it's trying to show, or what it is showing, is that these experiences of support and love and care actually have an impact on our health outcomes in adulthood. So that's for adult depression. It's the exact same dynamic with obesity, and they had a couple of other health issues that they identified as well, but I just picked those 2. Okay, so now congregations as healing communities, or these trauma-informed congregations. What could that look like? So I don't know how well you can see without with the lights on, but this is a congregation that I was a member of for many years. It's called University Church in Hyde Park. Some of you may be familiar with it. And so I just kind could be any church. This was a good picture, I thought. So let's start with the communion table. Is a great example of the way in which our liturgical life, we haven't really talked about liturgical life as a structure and a way for providing some of these kinds of caring experiences. So, I mean, the story that goes along with communion is a story of trauma and resilience, right? I mean, it's in the story. And then it's also very tactile. It engages our senses. This rhythm of ritual is also, in the literature, a really important healing activity for people. It helps to restore positive brain pathways, actual, making rhythm, being rhythmical, moving, singing, drumming, dancing, swaying, clapping, whatever. These actually, doing that is fun and good and inspiring and part of our tradition, but it's actually changing brain pathways when we do that. It's actually reducing our stress hormones. Okay, and then you said diversity, regardless of culture, you are welcome. Yep. Little things, name tags. Some of the people are wearing name tags, right? This song that they're singing, they sing this song. This is the same song they sing at the end of every service. So it is, if you're in this congregation, this song is the song that you are enveloped in at the end of every service. So there's, again, a rhythm and a meaning to this action of holding hands and singing this song. So there's, we could go on, and I know many of these people, and I know many of the stories that are behind these people as well, and so, we could be here all day. So here's the view from the other side. Now, this is a different day, so it's some of the different musicians, but, this is the other part of the circle that we didn't see in the other one. So that, children being integrated into this very powerful meaning-making moment in the congregation of singing together at the end of the service. With kids with shakers, again, they're actually physically involved in rhythm. And this is something that we could really learn a lot about in terms of how do we bring our bodies into worship. The other thing I'll tell you is that one of the people up there has a severe mental illness and has had a severe mental illness for decades and decades. One of the people in there lost a daughter in a tragic accident and has been, pretty devastated by it. One of the people in there is an atheist and only comes to church because they like music. So, again, if you can do this too. You can look at your choir, you can look out over your congregation, and you see all of these stories of these experiences that we carry, that we have, and at the same time that we also have this sort of ability and drive to be in meaningful relationships with each other that helps us to manage these experiences. Going back to that changingmindsnow.org website, one of the resources that's on there is this 5 healing gestures. And so when we start thinking about, well, what can we do? What can we do in our congregation to be trauma-informed? What can we do in our congregation to support resilience and really build relationality? I love this 5 healing gestures model because this is something that kids can do. This is something that preschool can do. This is something that everyone in the congregation can do. It doesn't take a doctoral degree. It doesn't take a special training. This is, again, rooted in science about what it is that makes a difference in terms of resilience. And so one of the things is, for kids, they're saying that these are things that you can do for kids, but I say for everyone, one of the things we can do is we can listen, be present, Actually really be present with someone and listen to them. Comfort, if someone is upset about something, if they're disrupted about something, to be a source of comfort to them. And each one of these, when you go on this website and you click, you'll see the science that they're drawing from, and then you'll also see they have suggestions for how do you listen with infants? How do you listen with preschoolers? How do you listen with all the way through adolescence? Very practical suggestions. Same for each one of these different areas. Collaborate. How do you get kids as partners in helping to figure out and problem solve issues that are happening, as opposed to just telling them this is how it's going to be. Inspiring. Hopefully we're doing that in our congregations. We're inspiring kids and each other in our journeys. And what did I miss? Celebrate. Noticing. Oh, I see that you accomplished this, or I see that you're, I don't know, anything really can be celebrated, So, simple thing that you can do with your youth group leaders, with your Christian education group, with even your church council or your whatever committees you have, your staff, to think about how are we going to do these things as a congregation? How are we going to listen? How are we going to collaborate? How are we going to comfort? How are we going to inspire? How are we going to celebrate? Okay? Just some other things that just practical things that we can do to develop ceremonies or rituals. Is a lot of times it's the ritual that it's the singing in the 4-part harmony, like we were talking about before, that is the sort of the profound connection that we have within a faith community, or it's the experience of going up for communion in the same way that we always do it in our congregation. That act of doing something in our liturgical life, including others in health promoting activities, engaging in multiple family or whole community dialogues. Like, here's this issue. What do we want to think about it? I think in our core group, maybe we were talking about. One of the people was talking about that as a church they decide on a whole, one issue that they're all going to be working on, and they identified mental health as their all church kind of a thing that they were going to work on. So how do we deal with things as a whole congregation or as a whole family? Art, movement, rhythm, music, how do we bring that more intentionally into our congregational life? I actually am not sure what effective accommodations, what I meant by that. Learning together, also really important experience of feeling like we're kind of moving along together and developing knowledge together in a sense of where we're headed. Mutual help and support systems. So the last thing I wanted to share is, this is the definition by SAMHSA, which is the National sort of Mental Health Resource Organization at the federal government. It's the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, I think is SAMHSA, what it stands for. Anyway, they have defined being trauma-informed as, you do these 4 things. You recognize that trauma exists, or you realize, what did I have first? You realize that trauma exists. So that's step number 1. You say, are we as a congregation realizing that many of our members, most of our members, have experienced some kind of trauma? This is part of all of our experience. And do we recognize the impact that that's having on the way that we're behaving together, the kind of conflicts that we have, the way that we handle conflict, the way that we're able to function together? And then do we respond? What's our response? How are we at the last one, someone was saying, one of the critical ways to enter into relationship, or from a trauma-informed perspective, is if someone is behaving in a way that we don't like, to ask not what's wrong with you that you're doing that, but to ask what happened to you that's behind what it is that you're doing. So what's our response? How are we being very intentional about how we're responding? And then the last one is to resist re-traumatization. So when you say to someone who may be acting out, who may be very quick to anger, to say, what's wrong with that person? What's wrong with you? That sort of re-traumatizes that person, as opposed to asking maybe, what happened? Or like, it changes your orientation toward that person. What's underneath there? Because one of the things that's in the trauma and resilience movement, one of the sort of core tenets is this idea that our behavior is adaptive to what the input is. So if we've had experiences of violence or conflict, or where we're constantly under threat, we are actually going to respond. We're going to prepare ourselves for that kind of thing to happen all over the place. And so it may be that we are quick to get angry, or we're impulsive, because that actually is adaptive for the environment that we've come out of. So to understand what is behind it. And then the last thing is, I added, which is repent, which I think specifically for faith communities is really important, because we have to also, as we talk about all the wonderful ways we support each other, we have to also talk and be very honest about the ways in which our faith communities and faith traditions wound and hurt people. That's also part of our legacy and part of what we do in faith communities. We have theology often that excludes, that judges, that shames. We often are not welcoming to the stranger. We often are suspicious and defensive of the stranger. And so, we have to, and we know that people in faith communities abuse others, physically, sexually, emotionally. Those things happen in our congregations. And so one step that I think is really important for congregations in this process of we want to be trauma informed is to also be honest about what do we need to repent from? How are we excluding? How are we hurting and wounding? How are we dividing? How are we abusing? So think about as well this idea of what's the language that we want to be using. And as you think about, does our congregation want to be trauma informed? Are those the words we want to use, or are there other words that would be, that would work better, that would have more power in our setting? I think there's an opportunity for some real kind of generative conversation among people of faith, of all faiths, not just Christian faiths, about how do we, as coming out of a faith perspective, really understand this dynamic. So. All right, well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you.